Hey guys, Vexe here from Unity Answers, and about a month ago I released my Show 'em All package for free, which was basically a bunch of property drawers and a half implemented and half completed serialization system for interfaces, generic types and properties, and basically everything that Unity doesn't know how to serialize very well. So you had like a bunch of um, attributes like constraints, decorations, enums, pop-ups, vectors, and you had a basic way to expose properties. So you annotate with show property, and you could expose methods. So you annotate with show method. You could inline objects, so for inline object editing, so you could define your own member categories. So you could say define a category for fields, properties, and say custom settings and whatnot. And you also had a better collection, so which looks a bit nicer. And I also had some serialization features. So I offer you basic serialization for interfaces and generic types, but it had a lot of limitations, from which, for example, you can't specify a certain serializer to use, and you can't easily add a serializer. I also had issues with the recursive serialization, and the editor wasn't, the API that I used wasn't perfect. So for example, let's say that I wanted to apply an inline attribute for each transform in this array. I can't do that. I couldn't do that in previous versions. Or let's say for each game object in this list I wanted to apply the read only. I couldn't do that. So there's a lot more limitations I'm not gonna go over, but basically I set out to write a new API which solves all of these problems and a lot of Unity's editor, basically the Unity drawing API problems. So I wanted to write something that is generic, that is strongly typed. I wanted to write a drawing API where if I write a certain drawer, I'd be able to apply it on fields and properties equally the same. And I also wanted to support attribute composition a bit more and a bit better than what Unity does. So this is just going to be an overview of my API. So here I have Unity stuff and my new API stuff, and just a comparison between the two. So this video is just going to be an overview of what you can do, of what this whole framework is all about. And so first just gonna be an overview, and then do a hands-on for the attributes themselves, and then hands-on for serialization, and maybe talk about some miscellaneous stuff, and maybe just give you an idea of the internal implementation of this API. So in this video I'm just gonna cover the differences between Unity's API and my new framework. So in Unity you can only write drawers for type that are supported by Unity serialization system. So you can't write a drawer for an arbitrary type. So so let's say you wanted to write a drawer for a dictionary, or a drawer for a stack, or a nullable drawer. You can't do that. In the new API you can write a drawer for pretty much any system type. So you can write drawers for dictionaries and lists and stacks and pretty much everything you want, regardless if the type was serializable or not. And we'll talk about that in detail later. So you can only apply attributes on fields and of course serializable fields. In the new API you can write drawers and apply them on any member. So you can write drawers for a method, property, or field. You can write a single drawer and apply it on a field or a property, because pretty much in my new API fields and properties are dealt with equally the same. And this was possible because internally I don't deal with field or properties individually. I just wrap them in a data member wrapper, and a strongly typed data member wrapper that uses faster reflect, which is basically a faster reflection implementation to be able to get and set the property or field value, and we'll talk about that a bit later. So yeah, you write a single drawer and apply it wherever you want, and you can also write drawers for methods. And the Unity API was not strongly typed. It was a lot of the times if you write a property drawer for some attribute, you had to write something like this. So you get a base attribute property, and then you cast it into your strongly typed into your custom property, and then you do something with this value. In the new API, you don't have to do this. You get an attribute property which is strongly typed, so you don't have to do this. In Unity's API, you have to deal with serialized properties, and if anyone of you have written any good amount of editor scripting, you know how much pain they are to deal with. They're not typed, they're very weakly typed. You have like an int value and a string value, and you couldn't wrap a system object with a serialized property. So serialized properties only worked for Unity Engine objects. They can only wrap Unity Engine objects. And if you've written before any code using them, you will get a very ugly code very quick. And in my opinion, the benefits you get from them aren't really worth the trouble of dealing with them. And I've never ever managed to successfully debug a serialized property in Unity VS. It's like whenever I wanted to expand the serialized value, the serialized property in Visual Studio, it would take like a couple of minutes, like at least 5 minutes or so, and that was just a pain. Instead, in the new API, you just deal with a data member, which I mentioned before, which is basically a wrapper. It's a strongly typed wrapper, and there's also another weakly typed wrapper if you want. There's conversion between the two if you like. So you can't manually expose a field unless it's serializable. So what do I mean by that is that you can't force the exposure of a field unless it was serializable. In the new API, exposing something is independent of serialization, so it doesn't have to be serializable for you to be able to expose it. You just annotate with show, and I'll show you when we come to the hands-on videos of how you can do that. There's no exposure for properties, methods, interfaces, and generics, of course. In the new API, they're all supported. And if you think about it, I mean, it's really sad. It's like Unity supports or exposes C#, which is a great programming language, but yet it fails to support many of its fundamental features, like interfaces and properties. It's like, if you want to expose a language, well, do it right. Just don't expose some of its features and leave the rest out, right? I've had to write a lot of ugly code due to Unity's limitations and not being able to fully take advantage of C# just because of its editor limitations and serialization crap, I should say. So Unity 5 is approaching, and we don't seem to have any inbuilt solution to this problem. However, I am looking forward to the audio mixer, which is promised to solve all of these problems and will probably make this API obsolete. So yeah, audio mixer, great job. Another thing was that attribute composition was a little bit picky. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. At least that was in my experience. And the new API composition works very well if you know how to compose and if you follow the composition rules that I will mention in the next videos. Drawers, when you write a property drawer, you can't use it outside a mono behavior. So say you're in an editor window, you can't use, so say you wrote a pop-up drawer or something, you can't use it unless you're in a mono behavior or in a serializable object, so you can't use it in an editor window, which makes it very limited. In the new API, you can use the drawers everywhere. They basically target a system object instead of Unity drawers targeting a Unity engine object. And also another cool thing, which you could do as an acrobatic kind of an acrobatic move, is that you could use those drawers on members that don't have any attributes on them. So you could do something like member field, some member, and pass in some attributes, and it would still work. So some member doesn't have to have an attributes for it to be drawn using some drawers. You could just pass in some attributes and a member, and I would draw your member using those attributes, which is pretty great, which is pretty cool. In Unity's API, you have to do a lot of type checks and some data validations to make sure that you're applying the attributes on the type that you should be applying it on. So, for example, if you write let's say a pop-up attribute, and you apply it on a Unity engine object, well, things might not work because you should be applying a pop-up on a string and not a Unity engine object. Well, in the new API, if you apply an attribute somewhere you shouldn't, it basically gets ignored and things won't blow up. And you don't have to do any validations to make sure that you're applying the attribute exactly where you should. So you have in Unity's API, you don't have any control on list and array drawing, and when you compose attributes on them, those attributes are applied on each element, and you couldn't apply attributes on the sequence itself or override the way they're drawn. In the new drawer, like we mentioned before, you can write a drawer for pretty much any type, so you can write a drawer for ilist of t, which means any sequence. Basically, ilist covers arrays and lists. So if you write a drawer for ilist, it will be used to draw arrays and lists, equally the same. And you also have the options to choose whether you want the attributes to be applied on the collection itself or on its individual elements. And we'll see how you can do that later. However, if you're decorating attributes for dictionaries, you can only choose to apply those attributes on the dictionary itself, the keys, or the values, or both, but not selectively. So you can't say like apply these attributes on the keys and apply other attributes on the values. That's just not the way it works, unfortunately. And in Unity, you can't use GUI layout in property drawer, which was a huge thrown off for me when I started editor scripting. So what I did was I wrote a GUI wrapper, which basically has an internal faster layout algorithm, and then it depends on GUI at its backend. In the new Unity, in the new API, you could use both GUI layout and GUI, which actually makes my GUI wrapper obsolete now. And by the way, I really like this approach of Unity on how to solve problems. I mean, in their documentation, they mentioned that you're not supposed to use GUI layout in property drawers because of performance limitations, and I really like the way they solved the problem. I mean, they solved it by letting their users having to write painful code and manually positioning stuff and dealing with rects and rectangles and having to deal with messy code. That's a great way to approach problem solving. Great job, Unity. So that was the editor part, and now to talk about some serialization features. So in Unity, there's very poor generic support. You could only serialize list. If you had a custom generic class, you had to subclass. So if you had like a class like this, like public class generic T, you can't have like references defined like this, generic of whatever. You had to subclass, so you had to say my gen is a generic of whatever. In the new API, generics are supported, and depending on your serializer, you could go crazy with your nesting. Like if you're using binary formatter, you could go crazy like this. You could say my gen of tuple of list of dictionary of list of tuple of whatever. Like you could infinitely nest types as long as your serializer supports it, and you don't have to worry about editor exposure, because in my drawers you could pretty much expose everything, even infinitely nested stuff. Another thing is that the majority of other useful collections was not supported, so dictionary and stack and queue and linked list and the whole 9 yards, there wasn't any support except for arrays and lists. In the new API, dictionaries are supported out of the box. You can, like I mentioned before, you could nest lists, so you could have 2D lists as long as your serializer supports it. If not, you could write an in-betweener, just like you used to do with Unity. And if you want to support other collections like stack, you could easily write a stack drawer. So say stack drawer of T is an object drawer of stack T. I'll probably make a video on how to implement stack, just for fun. There's, like I mentioned before, there's no support for interfaces, properties, abstract system objects, and generally no polymorphic serialization. And the new API, all of these are supported. But I decided not to serialize properties with side effects. I only decided to serialize auto properties. This is because if you have a property with a side effect, chances are it will have a backing field behind it, and so you could just serialize the backing field instead of serializing the property. So we'll come to that in detail in a little bit. So, and delegates are not exposed nor serialized, of course. Why would I think otherwise? So delegates can be serialized depending on the serializer that you're using. So binary formatter can actually serialize action and action T, func, and all that stuff. But protocol buffer -net can't. However, in this framework, I don't provide any delegate exposure. This is currently only available in my UF action package. Yeah. So you can serialize delegates depending on the serializer, but can't expose it. I might write a simple implementation and provide it for free with this package, or I might also just bring UF action here and make it for free. I don't know. I'm actually thinking about it, but I'm not sure. In Unity serialization, if you wanted to mark a field serializable, you had to use serialize field, and if you wanted to hide it, you had to use hide in inspector. And the new API, you could both these attributes are supported, as well as other alternative shorter attributes like serialize and save and hide for hiding. And like you mentioned, you could use show to force the exposure of something, even if it wasn't serializable. In Unity, of course, there's only one serializer, which is Unity Serializer. In my new API, there's currently protobufnet and binary formatter, and you could easily write your own. And you can even change the serializer implementation at runtime from the editor directly. And we'll see how you can do that. And of course, there's other limitations such as nullables. They're not serializable nor exposed. And in my new API, they're serializable and exposed. So there's a bunch of more limitations, but that's just from the off the top of my head. So in the next video, I'll cover some attributes. So till then, see you later.